is absolutely what Le Mans is all about. It's endurance. And there was this wonderful collective sense of excitement, huge sense of, and of course, it's a great, great story.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick. And it's time for part 2 of my interview with Peter Grimsdale and his fantastic Bentley story. The book is called Racing in the Dark: When the Bentley Boys Conquered Le Mans. So if you haven't heard part 1 yet, do that first and then come back here. There's a link in the show notes if you want your very own copy of the book, or maybe order it for a friend. And this is a perfect beach read for summer, which isn't far off. And it's the 100th anniversary of Le Mans, which we're marking here on the podcast all year, so it's a great time to read up on all that history. Before we get back to the story, I just want to thank Peter Grimsdale for his time. He was really generous in every way, and he can tell a story so well, don't you think? Whether it's on the page or otherwise. And he's got another project in the works you'll hear about later. And finally, one more thing. Stay tuned to the very end today, because I've got an announcement to make, and I'm going to tell you what's coming up next on the show. Okay, part 2 with Peter Grimsdale, coming up right after this. Hi guys, Maurice Merrick here, and I want to tell you what's new at Model Citizen Diecast. First, there's the 1971 Mario Andretti Ferrari 312 B2. It's a Formula One car in 1/43rd scale, and it's perfect for that shelf in your office. Or how about a pair of 1966 Porsche 906s, both from the Targa Florio and in different liveries, also in 1/43rd scale. And you can see these and many more special cars at modelcitizendiecast.com. Use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout for 10% off your order. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast. Because your inner child still wants to play with cars. So Peter, we're in like the mid-20s now. In 23, they finished 4th. It, as you say, Bentley was sold from there on.
Well, what happened was Duff didn't win his first race, but he was determined to come back. And in 1924, he won. But the thing you have to remember about Le Mans back then is nobody had ever heard of it. It was just an obscure thing in the middle of France. Nobody heard of Le Mans. It wasn't a particularly famous place. So it was like nice to do, but Anyway, Bentley by that time was completely hooked. So the following year, it was like, I'm going back with a team. None of the cars finished. 25, none of the cars finished. He went back in 26 with a team. Things were looking pretty good until the 23rd hour when Sammy Davis drove off the road and hit a sandbank, couldn't dig the car out, and didn't finish.
And that was it.
And it was like right after that, Bentley said, right, no more racing. Can't do it, not doing it. Now, Davis and his co-driver, Benjafield, were massive enthusiasts of the Bentley car. And Benjafield owned his own Bentleys. He was a doctor. He owned his own Bentleys, and he said, "Well, I'm going to buy the car that they'd driven in 1926, which was number 7. I'm going to buy number 7, and I'm going to go back on my own to Le Mans in 1927." And Bentley was just like, "Oh God, I can't not let them do it. Oh, to hell with it. I'm going to do it." Because one of Bentley's problems, many problems he'd accumulated by that time, was some pretty hostile shareholders. And because his attention really wasn't on building the business, and he and his brother didn't put the hours in to kind of nurturing and charming, good sources of money. He had these kind of cowboy shareholders who were just interested in a quick buck, and they were fairly, they saw that motor racing was just basically pouring money down the toilet, which in some ways it was. Anyway, Bentley's attitude was, to hell with this. We're going back. One last throw of the dice. Okay, 1927. And by that time, the company was it was as good as bust. They needed a benefactor or else.
Yeah, they were tens of thousands of pounds in debt, which was
Yes.
adjusted for inflation. It is an enormous sum.
It doesn't bear thinking about, really. I mean, how they ever slept. But I think it was basically denial on WO's part. He just like focused on the engineering and just sort of, because people loved the cars. They had great press. He acquired a reputation very quickly and he was selling them for a lot of money. It's just he wasn't turning any of it into profit. But he thought, right, last throw of the dice. We'll go one more time to Le Mans, see what we can do. And so he gets to Le Mans. He's got a new car as well. He's got a 4.5 litre Bentley. It's considerably faster. Same looking car, but same engine, but just bored out. Lot more powerful. Anyway, the 3 Bentleys lead from the start. It's all going incredibly well. It's all looking really good. There's no competition whatsoever until dusk falls. And one of the other competitors broadsides round the bend known as the White House, because there was a White House by the corner, otherwise known as Maison Blanche. And he's broadside in the road. And the Bentleys come tearing round this blind corner straight into this car. First the leader, then the second one. Some other cars pile in. And by the time the third Bentley comes around that corner, there are something like 5 or 6 cars in a great big heap, literally a tower. Nobody's been badly injured, but the cars are almost like they're piled up literally against each other. Sammy Davis approaching the corner, something causes him to slow very slightly. He can't remember what it is. We don't know what it was, but maybe it was maybe there was some fragments of stuff on the road. Anyway, he just comes around that little bit slower, straight on the corner, into this pile. Nothing he can do, except he tries to steer and he sort of slams into this pile with his left-hand front wheel. Gets out, tries to find the other drivers. The first thought is like, who's hurt, who needs help, But once it's kind of established that actually everyone seems to be around, they help one guy into the farm. And Davis thinks, well, he's so embarrassed because the last race, he blew it in that last race. He really can't face the idea of walking back to the pits and saying, sorry, WO, I've done it again. Anyway, he manages to reverse the car out. The one wheel is wobbling, there's only one light, and he staggers back to the pits. Now, you can imagine it's dark. Bentley's standing there in the pits. The cars have been going round and round and round this 12-mile circuit, and then suddenly silence. They've been standing there in complete silence. And then suddenly they hear the noise of what sounds like a Bentley engine. And there's one headlight going very slowly. And into the pits comes old number 7 with Davis at the wheel. Now, the rules forbade anybody during the race except the drivers from touching the car. So Davis has to try and effect the repairs that he can, while the others look on anxiously, passing him tools and so forth. Anyway, he changes the wheel, tries to strap the mudguard down so it's not flapping loose, and off they go into the night. And he and Benjafield wrestle this beast with its wonky steering and slightly unhappy brakes. And it kind of develops a spirit of its own, this car. By dawn, they're starting to go a bit faster. The engine's doing fine. And they've just got one, they're second. By 11 o'clock, they're coming like second. And there's a races on between Chasson, who's one of the greatest French race drivers of that time. Gradually, Davis and Benjafield reel in Chasson, and they take the lead. And they come home. They come home first. And, everybody in the pits, everybody, all the competitors, they're just overjoyed. They're so thrilled for them. They're so excited because it's absolutely what Le Mans is all about. It's endurance. And there was this wonderful collective sense of excitement. Those who retired or those who didn't come first. Huge sense about, and of course it's a great, great story. So not only does this race make Bentley's name, it makes Le Mans' name. Suddenly, Le Mans is a great big story.
Yeah, they were delivered from certain doom.
Yeah, delivered from doom, but financially still, their days are numbered. Until along comes Wolf Bonato. For me, Wolf Bonato, I was always a great fan of Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. And I can say that Wolf Bonato is the closest thing Britain ever had to a Gatsby. Although I should add to that is that Bonato was more legitimate, shall we say, in his business dealings than probably Gatsby turned out to be. And also, Bonato was an heir. His father, penniless Londoner, had gone off to South Africa and come back a diamond mining magnate. But he died mysteriously on the boat back from South Africa. And so from a very early age, Bonato and his siblings were heirs to a vast fortune. And Bonato wasn't just one of these feckless, rich, kind of P.G. Wodehouse characters. He was really a Renaissance man, Bonato, because not only was he extremely rich, he was very charismatic. He was an extremely good cricketer. He was an extremely good wrestler, boxer. You name it, he could do it really well. And when racing became a thing in the 1920s, he wanted to be a racing driver as well. And seeing that Bentley was in trouble, he decided that he would buy the whole company against his financial advisors. But he thought, no, to hell with this. I'll buy the company. He made himself chairman. He was quite a tough person as well. He somewhat demoted Bentley because Bentley became kind of chief engineer. But, really, I'd say Bentley were very, very lucky to have him. And of course, the deal was that, I will race at Le Mans. And this was like, okay, well, he's raced at Brooklands, but Le Mans is a slightly different thing. But a really interesting thing, and in some ways for me, this is the kind of heart and soul of the book. And by the way, I think will make the heart and soul of a great movie, is that you have these two characters, W.O. Bentley, diffident, somewhat depressed, brilliant engineer, devoted to his team, tireless, man who was incapable of celebrating when anything good happened, who carried so much grief deep inside him, had also, by this time, unhappily remarried to a woman who was much more interested in society and was, as somebody put it, was never going to sit on an oil drum with a stopwatch in her hand. Bonato was the polar opposite of Bentley. Exuberant, outgoing, extrovert, life and soul of the party, tremendous womanizer, but also, I must quickly say, a great respecter of women. And the story of his daughter, Diana, is a whole other story. But they were the most unlikely pairing, these two. And yet together, they did something really extraordinary. I think they kind of brought out the best in each other because Bonato enabled Bentley to raise his game. Let's be bigger cars, faster cars. Let's go to Le Mans. Let's take 4 cars. Let's really show them. And Bonato also listened to Bentley quite unexpectedly because everyone thought he was so headstrong, but actually in the car, Bonato would do exactly what Bentley told him. And this really came together in the 1928 Le Mans, which for me, in some ways, is the more exciting race. Because in the 1928 race, they had formidable opponents in the form of the Stutz, the American Stutz cars, fielded by a very interesting guy called Charles Weyman, who was half American, half Haitian, brought up in France, was an airman and then an aircraft designer, and had created the Weyman body, which in the 1920s, until press steel came along, was the way to build sedan bodies by building a frame where the joints didn't touch so the wood didn't squeak, and filling the panels with a stuffing that was both light and absorbed the sound. Very important, but also he was a big proponent of the Stutz car. Anyway, these were 8 litres, bigger than the Bentleys. And, well, it's a great story, but this race went right down to the wire because quite early on, the Bentley started cracking up. There was a weakness in the chassis. They started flexing. Things started to break. And indeed, on the penultimate lap, The radiator hose has detached itself from the radiator, so there's no water going into the engine. The engine's getting hotter and hotter. There is nothing Bonato can do about it. In fact, what he only realizes what's happened when he finds he's suddenly got water. He thinks, is it starting to rain? No, it's the water spewing out of the radiator, back over the windscreen, all over his face. He figures that if he can get round and bring the car in on 4 o'clock, he'll be okay, because 4 o'clock is when the race finishes. It goes from 4 o'clock to 4 o'clock. So he goes round as slowly as he dare, hoping that he doesn't get overtaken, brings the car up to the finish line, but it's 3:59. He's a minute early. He has to go round again. The car is getting hotter and hotter. He actually stops on one of the straights just to let the car cool down, and at a point where there's a bit of an incline so he can slowly start it up again. Crawls around, creeps around. Fortunately for him, the Stutz is having gearbox problems. They've got their own challenges, but they're on virtually the same lap, which almost never happens in Le Mans. Bonato brings the car home. Now, the only reason why Bonato won, in spite of all the problems, is because he listened to Bentley. Bentley was very specific about what to do, how fast to go. Always the racers, particularly at that time, just wanted to go fast as possible. I mean, Birkin was a nightmare for Bentley because he just drove as fast as he possibly could till the car broke. But Bonato listened, and Bonato did what he was told and won the 1928 race and the 1929 race and the 1930 race. A hat-trick which wasn't achieved for another 4 or 5 decades. It's an incredible achievement.
Absolutely incredible. And once again, that sturdiness that Bentley always believed in, it was one of the major factors, right? There was a sort of a furrow or a ditch that had developed in part of the circuit, and they were finding that the chassis was flexing, right? And the cars were literally getting smashed apart with every lap.
It just wore and wore away at them. There was a diagonal ditch for some reason across the road. I mean, such was driving on public roads. You come back 1 year, oh yeah, there's a ditch. Yeah, well, there's nothing we can do about this. We just have to drive over it for 24 hours. And it just worked away at some tiny little. Bentleys were really strong, but there was probably some joint that just a bit of metal fatigue sets in, and once it starts flexing, it flexes more and more and more. Nothing you can do. It was incredible that he got home. Incredible that he finished. Incredible that he finished first.
And yet, with all of this racing prowess and proving the machine, and their reputation continues to grow, the stock market crash of 1929 changes everything.
Yes, the effect is not immediate in Britain, but Bentley has just at that point launched his 8-litre car. And this is his, the pinnacle of and this car is fast, it's refined, it's a fantastic machine, and really more than a match for Rolls-Royce. But the Wall Street crash, the impact of it ripples slowly outwards. It hits the pockets immediately of the super rich. I mean, the super rich don't get poor overnight, but they get wary overnight. And of course, what happens is the market overnight completely dries up for expensive cars, not just Bentley, but also Rolls-Royce. Also, Bonato, whose financiers have always warned him that there's going to be no money in Bentley. And Bonato's, this is his toy, this is his plaything, But when the Wall Street crash happens, they go, we don't know what the full impact of this thing is. And Bonato has investments all over the place. They say, look, come on, you've got to get real. So he basically says, okay, I'm selling up. And Bentley has no alternative but to go into liquidation. It's quite ruthless, it seems. And, people are very, very critical of Bonato. But, back then, at that moment, Bonato had no idea how things would pan out. And they all thought that actually Bentley would probably, get picked up by someone else. They'd merge with somebody. It would be good. And Napier, a company that made aero engines, but also had made cars, but had stopped making cars in the mid-20s, very, very kind of compatible people with what WO was about. And it looks for a long time like the salvation is going to be with the Napier company. And WO even sets about starting to design a Napier Bentley that's going to be the car that they will produce together. And it's all going pretty well. And there has to be a hearing in front of a judge to seal the deal. And on the day, they all arrive at court. And a man who no one's ever seen before stands up, offers a higher bid. And they don't know who this person is. He's from some company they've never heard of, some investment company that no one's ever heard of. And the judge says, well, look, this isn't an auction. You can both give me your sealed bids at 4:00 and I'll decide. And this other financier has outbid the Napier bid. So Bentley is sold to somebody. He doesn't even know who this is when he goes home. His wife, who he's somewhat estranged from, living a completely different life, comes home from a cocktail party and said, there's a man at the party who said he's bought your company. He's from Rolls-Royce. And that's the first W. Bentley hears of who has taken him over. And what has happened is that Rolls-Royce have decided that as the market for luxury cars has shrunk, the last thing they need is domestic competition. So the easiest thing is just to buy this company for what they think is the rock bottom price. And essentially, in my opinion, asset strip it.
Such an ignominious end.
It is. It is quite shocking in a way. I mean, there's a certain financial logic to it. You can see why Rolls-Royce decided to do what they did. But what is really, really bitter about it is that in many ways, arguably, Bentley was just as good an engineer, if not better, than Henry Royce. Henry Royce did not want the competition. So and also, unfortunately for W.O. Bentley, he was tied to the company. The deal he had done when Bonato took him over was that he was tied to because he was the asset of the company. So whenever, in the event that Bentley got sold, he would be sold with the company. But as far as Rolls-Royce were concerned, they didn't really need Bentley. They had all their engineers in Derby. So they gave him a job as a sort of glorified test driver. It just awful, really awful. And they wound up the whole Cricklewood operation, the little factory in Cricklewood in North London. They ceased production of WO's cars, and that was the end of the line, or so it seemed.
And everything sort of moves to Derby, and the 8-liter engine is scrapped.
Yep.
And that must have been so humiliating for him.
Yes, but it's very interesting about Bentley because unlike so many engineers of his kind, he was very good at rolling with the punches, I mean, he was never very good at making money ever in his life. And at least he had a job, he still had employment. By that time, by the way, he had met the woman who became his third wife. And that was a very happy match. And I think he probably thought, well, I have another life. He was prepared to settle for it. He was not badly paid. And in fact, the deal was that it wrote off his debts. He owed the company a lot of money. So it cleared his debt. So he had that kind of peace of mind. And basically he said, well, okay, I'll just test these cars. And in fact, endeared himself to all the Rolls-Royce staff. So that once his kind of time, his kind of handcuffs were released, they offered him an extension and said, will you carry on working for us? And offered him quite a bit more money. However, happily for our story, Lagonda, which was a small company not unlike Bentley in some ways, it started by an American gentleman by the name of Wilbur Gunn. Lagonda, like Bentley, had been always financially precarious and was about to be taken over. And out of the blue, WO was approached to be their chief engineer. So very happily for WO, he was able to politely decline the Rolls-Royce offer and go to Lagonda and proceed to build a V12 engine, which was in many ways just as much a match for Rolls-Royce all over again.
Yeah, brilliant. The way that he handled the disaster of losing his company really speaks to the depth of his character it makes me admire the man that much more. I mean, the cars are fantastic and the racing victories are wonderful and the cast of characters that were the Bentley boys, just amazing. But at the end of the day, W.O. stands as, just this very admirable guy.
I think that's very true because, one of the things, and it comes through in his autobiography, but it's also supported by some of the mechanics and engineers who worked for him, who gave wonderful interviews much later on, is that he never took more credit than was due. He always acknowledged the work that his fellow engineers had put in, and indeed even the mechanics. I mean, he was very acknowledging of that. Whereas, there were people who did marvelous work for Bugatti, but you never got to hear their names. That was a big thing about Bentley, which is actually quite unusual throughout industry, where the chief guy likes to take most of the credit.
And he had earned the undying loyalty of his employees for that reason.
Yes, he did. Yes, I mean, many of whom he'd taken on as school leaver apprentices. I mean, Wally Hassan joined Bentley straight out of school, age 16. In about somewhere around 1920. I think he'd been at a workshop for a couple of years, perhaps. But by the 1920s, by the mid-20s at Le Mans. He's a mechanic on Bonato's cars. Into the 1930s, after Bentley, he's working at Brooklands for ERA. He's racing back at Le Mans as well. In the 1940s, he gets hired by William Lyons of Jaguar, goes to Le Mans, helps build the XK120. He moves on to Coventry Climax in the 1950s and develops the engine that enabled Lotus and Cooper to win Formula One. And then in the 60s, he's back at Jaguar helping design that V12 engine that subsequently goes back to Le Mans. So that means that Hassan is involved in motor racing, top flight motor racing, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 1990s, because the Jaguar wins at the beginning of 90s. That's an incredible record that I don't think anyone else can have achieved. Now, I'm stretching it a bit because Hassan wasn't there in 1990, but basically he was an influence, and it all starts with Bentley giving people opportunities. If Hassan had joined Rolls-Royce, I don't know, he certainly would have got to Le Mans.
Peter, the only other guy who immediately comes to mind that could sort of claim that longevity is Enzo Ferrari.
Absolutely, yes. It would be wonderful. I don't think Bentley and Ferrari ever met, but yes. I mean, two more different characters you couldn't find. The only thing they have in common was that utter dedication to racing.
Peter, I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention a little bit about your first automotive book, which is High Performance: When Britain Ruled the Roads.
Mm-hmm. So I'd written some fictional thrillers, which had done okay. And one of my childhood friends, who he and I were into cars from whenever, he wasn't really interested in my thrillers. He said, "When are you going to write a book about cars?" I don't know. I mean, I've always been interested because it's always dangerous when you try and kind of, you put your interests to work, your enthusiasms to work, can go badly. So I thought, well, I need an idea first. And I'd always been interested in what happened in the late 40s when Britain, having just come through the war, was completely broke. And the British government policy was what they called export or die. Basically, we've got to take whatever we can and sell overseas, sell in the dollar market, because we need those dollars to buy our raw materials. So the British motor industry was told by the government that they had to export 75% of their output, or else they wouldn't get the steel ration, because everything was rationed after the war. They wouldn't get the steel. And this was just like madness. I mean, most companies didn't even build left-hand drive cars. And the cars were wholly inappropriate for the American market. Anyway, just about every British car you can think of was shipped to America. And I mean, some of this, it was so embarrassing. I mean, the Austin A40, an 1100cc car, was more expensive than a 6-cylinder Ford. But because there was such a shortage of cars in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War in America, they did get sold. They didn't make too much money, but basically anything on four wheels, people sent off to the States in the hope. And a young gentleman by the name of Shel Cavalli, who'd just come out of the war, set up his own dealership in California. He was actually selling reconditioned Jeeps, I think he was. But he had this idea. Someone said, why don't you sell motorcycles as well? And there's a guy importing cheap British motorcycles. He's in New Orleans. Go and see him. So Cavalli gets on the Sunset Limited, is it? And takes the train down to New Orleans. And he's hanging outside the office of this British trading guy, Hambro, waiting for him to turn up. And suddenly, out of nowhere, appears this MG sports car. Okay, Cavalli says he never even heard the term sports car before, and he's certainly never seen anything like this. The only foreign car he'd ever heard of was Rolls-Royce and Mercedes-Benz. Anyway, he looks at this thing, and Hambro says, well, car, I'll take you for a spin. They go around the block. And Cavalli says it was love at first sight, because what Cavalli's looking at is basically a four-wheel motorcycle, which you can, instead of having your girlfriend or boyfriend on the back, you sit beside them. And also, sports cars in Britain are very much fair weather vehicles that you can only use on certain days. An open-top MG, you can use it any day you want. Anyway, he says to Hambro, well, I like this, never mind the motorbikes. He says, I like this. He said, well, you can buy three, you can take three home with you. And I'm looking for someone to sell these in California. So, so Cavalli takes them back to California, sells them at that weekend and orders 50 more. And by 1950, he is, the biggest importer of British cars in America. What happens is, completely out of the blue, America falls in love with the British sports car. Now, you probably don't realize this, but sports cars in Britain were unloved by the British motor industry. They'd seen what happened to Bentley. They knew what happened to Invicta and Lagonda. Basically, nobody made money out of sports cars in Britain. So why make them? The MG had a really bad time as part of Morris and then BMC. The bosses didn't really want to know this thing. And actually, the TC was really a car that had been originally designed in about 1931. It was not a new design. Anyway, they couldn't make enough of them. And all the other manufacturers thought, hang on, we better start making sports cars as well. So Triumph and Austin start thinking about how they're going to capitalize on this. And meanwhile, William Lyons produces the XK120. And he produces that car for the 1948 London Motor Show because he doesn't have his sedan yet ready. And he's got to have something to show off his new engine. So in a matter of weeks, he designs this amazing looking car. And he basically plans to make 200 because, it's a show car. It's a toy, really. By the end of day one of the Earl's Court show, he sold those 200. He has to productionize the XK120. He ends up building 13,000 of them. So this is a great story. How did this happen? Nobody's really told this story before. So what I did was I started writing the first few chapters just to see how I felt about writing this. And I showed them to my agent, who's not interested in cars at all. He said, I think I could sell this. So anyway, I was very, very lucky. Simon & Schuster came along and said, yeah, we like this book. Here's an advance. So that's how I came to write High Performance. And so what High Performance does, it basically tells the story of what I think is the Renaissance period of British motor engineering. From Britain before the war British auto industry had a very risk-averse engineering culture. They, unlike France were forging ahead with monocoque construction, pressed steel, independent suspension, front-wheel drive, none of that for the Brits. And yet, after the war, and by the 1960s, we owned Formula One. Everybody was redesigning their racing cars around what John Cooper and Colin Chapman are starting to do. We had the most revolutionary small car, the Mini, produced by Alec Issigonis. How did all this happen? I always like a kind of question to be answered, really, in a book. And it's just like, how did the Brits do what they did when they did, and why? And that basically is what high performance is all about.
It's a terrific book. You describe so vividly this wellspring of innovation, performance, racing prowess, and then how that translates to the industry in general, and how British cars became loved in the export markets, particularly the United States, of course.
Yeah. I mean, we were very lucky, and you guys were very forgiving because our cars weren't always too reliable. What is great about American auto engineering, I think, and it all dates back to the turn of the century, because the first cars in America, the motor car was never going to work in America unless you could go out into the countryside and come back. In Britain, there was always a blacksmith around the corner. So the kind of reliability that Bentley was aiming for in the 1920s was hardwired in to the American automobile from day one. Probably going back to before the Model T, the curved dash olds, probably a very, very reliable car. They had to be. Otherwise, it just wouldn't have happened. Those cars had to go into fields. They had to go where there were no roads and come back. And I think that, you guys set the bar very high, because really the rest of the world's cars, in terms of reliability and durability, just didn't stand a chance. It was just lucky that, for the rest of the world, that you just built these huge cars that nobody else could quite manage.
One of the early episodes of the podcast, Peter, was called The Men Who Built General Motors. And fascinating story, amazing characters, and the family tree there is unbelievable.
Yes, I bet.
Peter, what's next? You got anything in the hopper?
Well, yes, I have. I decided I ought to have a look at the Italian auto industry. And again, I was kind of wanting to ask that question, Silverstone, the first British Grand Prix, the first Formula One race, it's 1950. The King of England is there with his family, and they see the British cars not even get off the starting grid, and the Italians come first and second and third. And it's like, hang on, didn't we just beat these guys in a war? How did this happen? How did the Italians manage to do this a mere less than 5 years after being defeated in a war? What is it? How did they do this? So I thought that would be an interesting question to try and answer. And then I kind of rolled back a bit. I thought, where am I going to begin this book? Because I thought it'd be a bit like High Performance. I'll start after the war with that, tell that story. But then I started looking a bit further back, and I noticed that Italy didn't have an industrial revolution like France or Germany or America in the 1900s. That the motor industry in Italy was the Industrial Revolution. They had none of the coal, they had none of the iron ore, they had none of the advantages, they had none of the background. And yet, by 1906, they were winning races. How do they do this? What is it about these guys? So basically, I'm doing the story of the Italian auto industry, which is bitten off way more than I can chew, but I'll get there. It's a great, great tale.
I look forward to that. That sounds amazing. Today, we've been talking about racing in the dark, when the Bentley Boys conquered Le Mans. Peter Grimsdale, thank you so much. What a treat.
It's been a pleasure.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. If you like what you've heard, take a minute to follow the show, leave me 5 stars and a quick review. And if you're anywhere near Southern California, you need to make it out to Orange County on Saturday, March 18th, because my friends at the Lion Air Museum are putting on their 4th annual Shelby Tribute Day. And this is a terrific event, and you'll be able to see a huge gathering of Shelby iron, as well as the Lion's collection of warbirds, including the B-25 Mitchell, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and others. And they may even have some fly-ins too, I'm not quite sure, but they do that from time to time. That's Saturday, March 18th, and I've got a link in the show notes. Tickets are $14. They've got discounts for veterans and seniors. Kids are like $7. So it's a great family day. And totally by coincidence, the next episode of Horsepower Heritage is all about Shelby. It's a celebration of 60 years of Shelby performance, and you won't want to miss that. So I'll see you back here on Wednesday, March 22nd. And in the meantime, go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage and you can make a monthly donation to the show. Much appreciated. And until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.